Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Thursday, the 21st of October. My name is Maggie Lennon and we'll start the programme as usual with the up-to-date coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 3,347,719 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,730,133 have been confirmed negative, with 617,536 having tested positive. There are 2,355 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will have been tested. There are 32 newly reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,012. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who've tested positive, 917 were in hospital last night, 58 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 4,297,028 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,886,176 had received their second. The latest UK daily figures show 139,148 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness. That's an increase of 115 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. I'm joined tonight from Edinburgh by Broadcasting Scotland regular Peter Curran. Good evening, Peter. How are you?
Evening, Maggie. I'm well. Yourself?
Good. I'm very well, thank you. We're going to start with the most recent news from the New Zealand and UK trade deal negotiations. Responding to the announcement that agreement in principle has been reached on a trade deal between the UK and New Zealand, a Scottish Government spokesperson said any deal with New Zealand will not remotely offset the damage to our economy caused by Brexit. Even the UK Government's own scoping assessment published last year said a deal with New Zealand would result in zero increase in GDP and that the agriculture and semi-processed food sectors would be likely to lose out. Aside from the economic arguments of seeking new deals with markets thousands of miles away while putting up barriers to trade with our European neighbours, the climate change implications of long-distance trade must also be considered. The Scottish Government was not involved in the negotiations, which led to this agreement in principle. The recent agreement in principle with Australia has caused great concern among Scotland's farmers and crofters, and we said at this time that it would set a precedent for New Zealand and called on the UK Government to protect Scotland's food producers. Nevertheless, it has committed to remove tariffs on meat and dairy products from New Zealand, and it must now bring forward proposals to protect those sectors in Scotland and mitigate the communities that are impacted by this deal. It's vital that devolved administrations are involved in the next stage of the New Zealand process so that they can ensure Scotland's interests are protected. The SNP has said that Scotland faces a growing threat from the cumulative impact of post-Brexit trade deals as the UK government faces a growing backlash from Scottish farmers, crofters and producers over both the New Zealand and Australian deals. Deirdre Brock, MP, said Scotland's interests had been sold out in the New Zealand trade deal, just as they were in the Australian trade deal, with an increasing danger that Scottish farmers, crofters and producers will lose out from the cumulative impact of those deals. With the New Zealand deal expected to result in a zero increase in GDP, the SNP Environment, Food and Rural Affairs spokesman said that no deal could offset the damage of Brexit. It comes as NFU Scotland reacted with anger and dismay at the New Zealand deal this morning, warning the deal threatens the viability of Scottish farmers and crofters as it grants a major exporting nation unfettered access to the UK and offers virtually nothing to Scottish farmers, growers and crofters in return. Well, Peter, this has been predicted that this was going to happen, especially after the announcement of what was going to be in the Australian trade deal. Do you think there's any possibility that the UK government will bring in anything to mitigate the potential impacts of these two deals?
short answer is, well, highly unlikely to know. Uh, I mean, what we're seeing here is what we'll also unfortunately be seeing at the COP26 conference. We're seeing nations, when the chips are down, acting in what they see as their own self-interest. I mean, it used to be called in the 19th century the Great Game, this great balance. New Zealand, I think most Scots probably think of New Zealand and maybe to a lesser extent Australia as among the good guys of the world. And they are, in a sense, New Zealand in many respects, you could say, is like us. But at the end of the day, they are off the coast, if you like, of giant countries like China and the whole Pacific problem. It's hard to see what Scotland can do about it. I mean, yes, it's easy for us to make capital of it in the sense that this argues for our independence. The reality is, if we were independent, we would still not be able to influence deals such as this. So it's very difficult to find a base for comment. I mean, I can be critical of New Zealand and say this isn't really in their interest when you see what it brings to their GDP and the damage it does to other relationships. But they have made their judgment, or this government of New Zealand has made their judgment. Equally, I can be critical of UK, but I don't expect Boris to do anything that does any favours to, or indeed has any significant consideration for the welfare of Scotland. I mean, in his more rational moments, he might consider that this is only going to push the case for independence still further. In terms of influencing deals on this scale, it's rather like saying, what influence is Scotland going to have on the COP26 thing? And there's a lot of pessimism surrounding the whole nature of COP26, and we'll come to that later. So I don't want to be sounding despairing, but this is countries doing what countries do, acting in their own self-interest. This is what politics was invented to try and balance out conflicting interests of different groups on how societies or interacting societies should be run. And we hope that they will all take account of some higher, not higher authority in the sense of religious, but some overarching look at the interests of the globe. I can't see any end to this, but more problems with
No, I
tariffs.
mean,
So
the trade deals have not exactly been coming thick and fast since Brexit. I mean, there's still no
no,
movement at all on an American trade deal. So it's no surprising that the British government makes a big fuss when these ones
indeed
do get
not.
announced. But the fact that it's going to have not a single positive impact on Britain's GDP really is quite outrageous. And as I like you, I suspect that all that Scotland can do and all that the NFU can do and all that farmers and crofters can do is keep making the point that it's going to be damaging. It does make you wonder, though, just how many farmers in Scotland who voted for Brexit are really beginning to think they were turkeys voting for Christmas. Closer to home,
Well,
the SNP has urged the UK government to provide urgent financial assistance to support low-income families suffering from the cost of living crisis. As new statistics reveal, the number of low-income households in arrears has tripled since the pandemic began. The analysis, which has been conducted by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, has revealed the extent of the debt crisis hanging over the UK's lowest earners as the country prepares to face a cost of living crisis this winter. The report found that 3.8 million people, that's 33% of low income households across the UK, are currently in arrears, with bills totalling 5.2 billion. The report also concluded that 950,000 were in rent arrears, 1.4 million are currently behind on council tax bills, and a further 1.4 million are behind on their electricity and gas bills. The problem's only enhanced for those within the working age household category, that's 18 to 64, with 44% of that group in arrears. Furthermore, almost three quarters, that's 71% of households aged between 18 and 24, are in arrears. The SNP Work and Pension spokesman David Linden MP has urged the Prime Minister and Chancellor to make an immediate U-turn on the cut to universal credit. and to offer an emergency financial package to boost household incomes to make up for the soaring costs low-income families are facing. I think the important thing there are the debts related to housing, because that's people who are paying rent and paying council tax. This is not people who are on housing benefit. So the suggestion is these are people who are the working poor, people who are working and still in arrears. It's a shocking set of statistics, Peter.
Yeah, it's a shocking statistic, not least of the fact that it's probably in many cases landlords, and Scots landlords at that, doing this to their own people. I mean, we're in a period when completely expedient profiteering is engaged in by opportunities presented by big events like COP26. I'm sure people are ratcheting up their rents and their rates for a whole range of things at this time. I mean, the bottom line is the role of government is to enforce some kind of morality, or at least ethical basis and equity upon the behaviour of, I want to turn into Kevin McKenna, rampant capitalism. What are we going to do about it? I mean, the Conservative Party is rooted in the concept of property, wealth, using property to gain wealth. And Scotland is in the position it is in this, and I've been through this in many comments before, Maggie, that we are appealing to a government to be reasonable, human, and change the law at the same time as we're saying to that government, we don't want to be ruled by you and we want our own independence. So we're forced into this contradiction of we're begging the people to be merciful, if you like, in these respects, while at the same time saying we want out. I don't know what answer there is. I mean, Nicola, I think yourself is
it's not about asking a government to be merciful. It's asking a government to be decent and to support the lowest income households. But obviously, those are the very people who are never going to vote Conservative anyway. So, as you were saying in the previous story, Peter, politics is all about self-interest. So there's no benefit to the Conservatives to be seen to doing anything for that group of people. They've written them off. They're never going to vote for them. But again, you're wondering, where's the Labour Party in this? Where's the rest of the opposition? It always seems to be the SNP who are the voice of reason and the voice for those who are most disadvantaged. But you're not seeing Keir Starmer standing up and making these points.
Well, there's a short answer to it.
Uh-huh.
There's a short answer to that, Maggie. The difference is the SNP are in government, have been in government for 14 years. The Labour Party in Scotland are not in government, are likely to be in government, and the Labour Party in Great Britain is not in government, are likely to be in government. So here we have a government with a limited measure of autonomy, addressing itself to the main government, which has virtual total autonomy, and saying, okay, the word merciful was ill chosen, decent, be decent about this. That call, what can you say about it?
Yeah, decency is not a word that the Conservative government use. And you're right, the Labour Party are not likely to ever be back in power unless they stand up for people who are disadvantaged. It's not the only thing that the SNP has been critical of this week in regards Rishi Sunak and demands for his budget. They've also challenged him to use the autumn budget to reverse the trend which has seen the UK finish behind all of its Northwest European neighbours on key issues such as inequality, pension poverty, unemployment benefits, recovery and wages. Ahead of next week's autumn budget, the SNP has urged the Chancellor to deliver a major investment package to boost productivity, economic growth and wages ahead of a winter of deep uncertainty. The call comes following House of Commons library research, which found the UK had the worst levels of inequality, the least generous pensions, the poorest unemployment benefits, the weakest economic recovery, and the highest percentage of low-paid earners in all of Northwest Europe. The findings included the UK offering only 28% of the average working wage to pensioners, the lowest in Northwest Europe. The UK ranking lowest in 95% of unemployment laws, the least generous in Northwest Europe. The UK's GDP per capita currently sitting at 5.8%, the lowest in Northwest Europe. And the UK having 20.3% of workers in low paid jobs, the highest in Northwest Europe. I mean, these figures for a country as rich as the United Kingdom are utterly devastating. I'm not surprised by much that this government in Westminster does, but when I saw these figures today, I was really shocked.
Yep. And I can match you emotion for emotion and indignation, Maggie. The question is, where does it take us? I mean, that's what politics is about, not expressing your indignation at the inhumanity of the people you want out of power, but how do we change that? And so we're forced constantly back on the fact that appeals to this government. And I don't doubt that if we had a Keir Starmer Labour government tomorrow, we would have not exactly, but a shading of different problems. We're back to the fact that what is the point of wasting energy on it, other than to point out that we cannot continue to live under this disunited kingdom, this inequitable, unjust, Tory-led, Brexit-led country. But I mean, I'm not anxious to waste energy on going and shouting my indignation from the rooftops. Indignation is the least productive of the emotions. We can all muster it. It doesn't take us anywhere. What are we going to do?
Well, I think what it does take us, though, is it does point out just what a mess the United Kingdom is in. And these figures, of course, are not getting the sort of national coverage that you might expect from sort of mainstream media outlets. So people don't really know how bad it is. And so you're left with the spin and the take on things that we get from Boris Johnson's government. And he spins everything. I mean, spinning plates is one thing. So I suppose that's really the only point of it, is to keep pointing out that that Britain really is the poor man of Europe. We've been told that Scotland's the sick man of Europe for long enough, but Britain is the poor man of Europe. And I mean, the GDP figures there, and we've just learned that they're entering into trade deals which are not going to improve GDP. I mean, given that the Conservatives are so fond of business, if a chief executive ran a company in such a bad way with such poor results in terms of their competitors, they'd be out on their ear. It just makes you wonder what it's going to take. Maybe the health situation is going to be another nail in Boris Johnson's coffin. Today, he insisted that there was no need for the government to move to Plan B because COVID cases were not rising beyond expectations. Asked why Plan B was not being triggered now, he said, "We're continuing with the plan we set out in July. We're watching the numbers very carefully every day. The numbers of infections are high, but we are within the parameters of what the predictions were. What SPIM, the modelling group, and the others said we would be at this stage, given the steps we're taking. We're sticking with our plan." He also said the position going into the winter was incomparably better than it was 12 months ago. Health Minister Edward Agar said today that current pressure on the NHS is sustainable, and he denied the government had a Plan C that would ban the mixing of households at Christmas in England if cases continued to rise. Mr Agar told BBC Radio 4's Today programme that while the NHS was under huge pressure, it was not the right time to introduce any additional measures to control the spread of COVID. The British Medical Council chair, Dr Chand Nagpal, however, accused ministers of being willfully negligent after the Health Secretary ruled out immediately implementing the government's coronavirus Plan B. I guess, Peter, I'm kind of surprised that they've got a plan at all. Certainly doesn't seem like it. I was down in London a couple of weeks ago, and while people in London are generally pretty good at wearing masks in shops and on public transport, and remember, it's not mandatory down in England, other friends have been elsewhere down south and said it's just there's not a mask to be seen anyway. Jacob Rees-Mogg came out today, and when they were criticised for Tory MPs not wearing masks in the House of Commons, he said it's because they were all pals with each other. So What do you make of these figures in England? They're over 50,000 for the first time since July today. Scotland's figures are sticking stubbornly around the 2,500 mark and have been for a few weeks. What do you think? What do you make of the trend? Should we be worried? Is there going to be another lockdown?
Yes, we should be worried, and we should be worried as Debbie Schreeder, if I've got her name right, told us today. We should be worried about the influx of 30,000 people for COP26 is going to do to ameliorate this. The whole of governments, normally politicians, are motivated by short-term expediency, whether they're at mid-term or close to an election. How will this policy play? How will that policy play? The only time nations seem to become halfway rational is when they're facing giant threats, as we've shown in successive wars. The wars may have been a bad idea, they certainly all were a bad idea, but at least the nations got together to face the threat in a rational way. But we are facing twin threats now that are even greater than a war. Wars begin and end within a matter of years normally. We'll leave out the 100 Years' War. So I can only reprise and say, yes, we use the word shit come up recently, and to avoid delving into my vocabulary for bigger words, the United Kingdom is disunited, it's dysfunctional, it's in gross shit state. To be continental about it is deep in the murdy. We know that. We know that. And yet, a recent poll, John Curtis was quoted on today, has shown that people are not shifting their opinion of Boris. They're not shifting their opinion of Brexit. If anything, people are hardening into their Remain, leave policy. I mean, I meet Brexiters every day. I don't have to go far outside my door to meet a Brexiter. And this is in Scotland, where 62% voted against it. And they are immune to facts, they're immune to reality. They swallow every piece of spin that's put forward to it. As for the media, well, in a sense, we can say we get the media we deserve. I tend to be categorized as a defender of the BBC because I look at the huge number of positive things the BBC did and still does in my lifetime. But in terms of news management, in terms of the media's, well, leave aside the rags, the Herstein rags like the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, and look at some relatively more responsible broadsheets. The only one that really gives good intellectual, rigorously factual coverage day after day is The Guardian as a newspaper. And it's fortunate enough to be funded by a trust. But we're up against, I mean, I don't know if you saw the thing about the CR unit, the Climate Reduction Unit, the two programs, the dramatization called The Trick and the subsequent documentary showing what happened. This was the massed might of countries like Saudi Arabia and countries with vested interest in oil, the big oil companies, the big fossil fuel providers, not only to distort the facts, but to try and crush the scientists involved, to destroy them. They took the key climate scientists close to suicide. But we're dealing with gross immorality. The indignation of the people, I've said indignation is a non-productive emotion, but the indignation of the people en masse is not manifesting itself in the way it should be. And I include Scotland in that.
It's not manifesting itself in a huge surge for independence. I mean, a close friend of mine said the other day when I said, "Oh well, we're maybe at about 52% in favour of independence on a good day," and she said, "Well, if we're only at 52%, given what we're facing with Westminster, that's outrageous. We should be at 72, no problem at all, because." As you say, there's just so much dysfunctionality happening from Westminster, and it seems at such odds from where we are in Scotland with our attitudes to things. But we should point out, although Although the figures for the daily infections in Scotland are not really rising, and 2,500 is well under the sort of 10% of the national figure, which is where we'd expect Scotland to be, our deaths are higher percentage wise, and we're back up to over 900 in hospital. So I think that is a concern. And I agree with you. I'm extremely concerned how that's going to be affected by the influx of people coming into Glasgow for COP26. I think there's a lot of things could go wrong at COP26, and the fact that it might actually act as a super spreader event concerns me. We spoke a bit earlier about the fact that the British government doesn't seem to have any decency in its vocabulary, and there's nowhere that that's more evident than in the treatment of refugees. Even, it appears, the refugees that they actually like, the ones that they have brought over or are bringing over from Afghanistan, ones who worked for the UK government. Council leaders, especially in England, are making contingency plans for thousands of refugees evacuated from Kabul to remain housed in hotel rooms for up to a year, while criticising ministers for slow progress in finding long term housing for people who fled Afghanistan. More than 2 months after the airlift to the UK, about 7,000 refugees remain in hotel rooms and have been given no guidance about when permanent homes are likely to materialise. Local government officials warn it's unsafe to keep large numbers of children in hotels on a long term basis and say the uncertainty is compounding the trauma they experienced when they fled with their families in August. Launching Operation Warm Welcome at the end of August, Boris Johnson promised to support the 8,500 Afghan refugees who were brought to the UK to rebuild their lives in Britain. Committing the government to provide the support needed, he added, "We will never forget the brave sacrifice made by Afghans who chose to work with us at great risk to themselves." However, council bosses in areas of the UK with refugees in about 80 hotels have complained that failures of planning and funding are making that welcome impossible to provide. Although council leaders have expressed a desire to do everything they can to support the refugees, they list a number of complaints about the handling of the resettlement programme. Several councils said they've been given no advance notice that the Home Office was block booking hotels in their area and were unable to start preparing services until refugees had already arrived. Now, I should say that this is mostly, we think, in England. All 32 local authorities in Scotland have again stepped up and said they will accept Afghan refugees, just as they accepted Syrians through the Vulnerable Persons Relocation Scheme. My understanding is that not yet all 32 local authorities have received Afghan families, but those that have are not in hotels, they're in houses, they're in homes, and local authorities are stepping up to the mark. So it seems to be an issue in England. And it seems to have come about primarily because people had to quarantine in hotels to begin with. There were horrific stories, Peter, of not being given baby food, of women not being given sanitary protection in these hotels, of being given nothing really. Now, as I said at the beginning of this story, these are the refugees that the government likes, the ones that they want to let in, not the ones that come and claim in country. And if they can't treat them with dignity or respect, what hope does anybody have? I don't know if you've been keeping up to date with the plans for refugees coming from Afghanistan, but what do you make of this latest rather distressing piece of news?
Well, I mean, government, given the nature of the Afghan crisis, which is complex beyond belief when you go back to its roots and look at all we did and where the right lies and where the wrong lies, it was inevitable that the government, unlike their normal approach to refugees, was going to involve virtue signalling in this. They were going to say, oh, yes, we owe these people a debt of gratitude, meaning the people that helped the Americans and the British forces doing good work. I don't question the decency or the contribution of these people, but they're basically saying these people were on our side against the wicked Taliban, and look what we've done to them. Let's demonstrate that we welcome them in. The idea that any British government, Britain as it's constituted at the moment, I try not to use the word Britain, it sticks in my throat these days, they would have any form of structured plan. Being realistic, any government dealing with refugees and what you do with them when you've agreed to have them they will be argued to be wrong on everything they do. And that's relevant whether they're a decent government or a bad government or an evil government. Whatever they do, they're going to be wrong. If they put them in the hotels, look at them. They're putting these people in their hotels when our own people can't even find a council flat. If they put them in a council flat, they're saying these are people who are keeping our own people who were in the queue for ages. The mass of the people is not possessed of deep liberal values when it comes right down. I mean, again, I live on a main street. I can hear it any day. I could hear it any day in the pub when I went there. There's a hotel somewhere, and it's full of refugees. My wife's cousin, 3 times removed, has been, you know. So we're going to get this mix again. No surprises. All we can say is, in an independent Scotland, I believe, hope. I hope not against hope, that we would do things better, more humanely.
Well, we do. I
Uh,
mean, we do in terms of how refugees are treated. I mean, we don't have control over immigration, but we do have control of the levers of integration, and we do
well,
things considerably better. To the point that there was a time when asylum seekers arriving in the UK discovered they were being sent to Glasgow, dispersed without any say. People were a bit depressed, all didn't know much about Glasgow, apart from the weather wasn't very good. When it became clear that actually asylum seekers in Scotland get a much better deal in terms of the services and activities they've access to, people were wanting to come to Glasgow. So we do much better. And the local authorities in Scotland have really stepped up to the mark very well with the Syrian refugees who came through that scheme, and I'm sure will do with the Afghans. But, you know, you think that governments should learn from previous mistakes. At the start of the pandemic, for reasons that no one can find out, the Home Office removed asylum seekers from accommodation that they were staying in. That's a local authority accommodation, and moved them into hotels. And we had that terrible incident in Glasgow where, as a result of partly to do with that and other stress, an asylum seeker murdered other asylum seekers. It was a
yeah,
dreadful
I
fuss. As a
remember.
result,
I remember.
because of that, Glasgow at the moment won't take any new asylum seekers into the city while they're still being housed in hotels, for the very reason that we said in the story, that it's extremely bad for people's physical and mental health. So we hope that that situation improves, and we hope that those Afghans lucky enough to be dispersed to the 32 local authorities in Scotland have a better and a more appropriate welcome. We've been talking about COP26 throughout the programme, and there's another possible problem over the horizon, and we're only a couple of weeks out, and that is that countries that produce coal, oil, beef, and animal feed have been lobbying to water down a landmark UN climate report, according to a leak of documents seen by Greenpeace's investigation team. Days before COP26, the international climate change negotiations taking place in Glasgow, the leaks show that fossil fuel producers, including Australia, Saudi Arabia, which we've already mentioned, Iran, and Japan, are lobbying the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to remove recommendations that the world needs to phase out fossil fuels. According to the documents, the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, whose members include Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela, also backed weakening the report's recommendations on fossil fuels. Meanwhile, large meat and dairy producers, such as Brazil and Argentina, reportedly attempted to change messages about the climate benefits of promoting plant-based diets, according to the leak of more than 32,000 comments by governments, corporations, academics, and others on the draft report of the IPCC's working group. Which looks at measures to protect the globe from rising temperatures. The IPCC said its processes were designed to guard against lobbying, and that in order to do this, it used diverse and balanced author teams, a review process open to all, and decision making on text by consensus. Now, you don't have to know very much about the science of climate change, I wouldn't have thought, to know that fossil fuels are the bad guys. So how these countries think they can get away with watering down that message is astonishing. I guess it's just back to more self-interest, Peter.
And they think they can get away with it because they do get away with it. I mean, the thing I was referring to earlier, the the climate research unit in the University of East Anglia, this was and is a world-renowned unit. They hacked into that. They got hold of emails. They grossly distorted them. They used their massive publicity machines, and it was probably a mixture of countries and the industries in country, notable the big fossil fuel company. I mean, Mobil, their behaviour is beyond the pale. But they've been doing this for years. I mean, one of the famous Scottish benefactors and philanthropists, which he was, Andrew Carnegie, hired goons to machine gun strikers from railway trucks and railway sidings. Big business has been behaving like this throughout all of my lifetime and before my lifetime back into the 19th century. They're doing it with a slightly greater gloss, a far greater ability to conceal themselves. But what are you to do? I've spent my life being involved, not as highly as I should have been. I mean, I'm ashamed of myself. I could have been more involved in politics than I was. But I was aware of politics. I tried to do the right thing. And after all these decades, I say to myself, I've really got to boil it down into simplistic things. Express revulsion when you see it. Try and correct misfacts when you see it. Try and help practically when you see people. Meanwhile, what can I help to have a real feel that I can help to achieve politically? And that's the independence of one tiny nation that has punched way above its intellectual, scientific, and political weight throughout its history. So,
Well, can I
really
ask you, Peter, given that fossil fuel producers and beef producers are clearly trying to fiddle the science and fiddle the facts, given that Russia and China are not coming to COP26, who are two of the world's biggest polluters, is COP26 going to achieve anything apart from risking spreading COVID throughout the central belt of Scotland?
Well, I'd love to be positive. I'd love to turn into Boris Johnson and say, or look on the bright side of life and hope that there's enough rational people who can deploy rational arguments, because it has to be rational arguments. There's no good appealing to the emotions of these people. I mean, all of them have children, grandchildren, etc. At that level, unfortunately, many of the individuals involved in it think they're invulnerable. And they're not. But they have to believe that somehow, if it happens, they will escape it. So I don't think, I'm pessimistic about the outcome. And with the foreshortening timescales, I'm terrified about the outcome. I mean, I've got a family into the fourth generation. I've got two great granddaughters just at school. You know, the thought of the world they're facing appalls me. It reduces me to tears at times. And what the hell is their great granddad doing about it? The other thing that worries me is the good guys who will be out to express the indignation of the people, which I'm arguing for, may well give a big publicity coup to the people who are opposed to the COP26 climate change outcomes. I think we may well be facing a level of chaos and multiple playing of facts, and these people will seize on single individuals on the pretty sound bet for any ruthless politician that the population, you never get rich or get politically advanced by overestimating their intelligence. They're going to play to the lowest common denominator. The first person that stops a bus, lies down in front of a truck, is going to be subject to. The police are already taking stick, and from a number of political critics who should know better, on the basis that they are trying to police these things without confrontation and, as they said, deal in the proper way with unlawful acts. But their critics think that somehow they can rush in at the time and drag a protester and say, you are committing an unlawful act, hold them up to the cameras of the world as they drag them by the hair from in front and saying, I am going to charge this person. This is the kind of thing we're up against.
The thing that I found slightly bizarre is that there have been there are going to be official protesting allowed. So there are certain groups who are officially allowed to protest. And I would have thought the whole thing about protest is that it's not kind of advertised in advance. That you're not official protesters. It's like the official festival and the fringe. Are we going to? We've got official protesters, and what happens when we get the fringe protesters? So I
I
mean,
get,
I have to say I'm fairly sceptical, not of climate change at all, but I'm pretty sceptical too of
I
just
know, no,
what's
no,
going to be
no, no.
achieved by it, and I'm not sure very much. But
Can I offer my definition
uh
of
huh,
what is an acceptable protester? An acceptable protester is someone who protests in a fashion which will be totally ineffective in achieving their aims and will cause not a moment's inconvenience to the people who are hell-bent and carrying on doing what the protesters are trying to stop them doing.
yeah, I think well that's probably then what we expect from the official protest. Going to take the
Yeah.
stories offshore for a bit, as we've been dwelling rather sadly on the misery that we're seeing around the UK, and that's the news that Barbados has elected its first president with just weeks to go until the Caribbean island becomes a republic and ceases to recognise Queen Elizabeth as its head of state. The island's Governor General, Dame Sandra Mason, was elected almost unanimously by the country's parliament on Wednesday, with only one member declining to vote. Mason, a 72-year-old judge and former ambassador, will be sworn in on the 30th of November, the 55th anniversary of the country's independence from the UK in 1966. The Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, hailed what she called a historic landmark for the island of about 290,000 people. How can anyone deny the rightness of the moment, Mottley said, according to the Barbadian newspaper The Nation. Barbados announced its decision to part company with the monarchy in September last year, amid an intensifying global debate on the malign legacy of colonialism and racial injustice. Speaking at the time, Mason argued that the time had come for Barbados to fully leave our colonial past behind. Barbadians want a Barbadian head of state. This is the ultimate statement of confidence in who we are and what we are capable of achieving, she said, reading comments prepared by the Prime Minister. So obviously, Barbados is not the first Caribbean state to dump the Queen. Trinidad and Tobago did it in 1976. The Dominican Republic did it in 76 as well. And Ghana did it in 1970, 4 years after they gained independence. It's taken Barbados a bit longer. Jamaica, it's rumoured, are thinking of doing the same. So what do you read into this, if anything, Peter, in terms of the future of the monarchy elsewhere, where the Queen Elizabeth is head of state, and generally attitudes towards Britain?
For a moment before I answer as fully as I can to lighten the misery, let me offer this. Oh, Barbados, you're going to dump the Queen. I'm delighted, Barbados, but you're going to dump the Queen. Why should you want a monarchy? Why should anybody want a queen? Why can't we do it all in our lovely islands and our sun shining without them? Go, Barbados. Dump the Queen. Dump the Queen. Now, having said that, the Barbados, and I love the Barbados and all the islands and all the wonderful music they've produced. Why can't the rest of us do it? I mean, the whole concept of monarchy is based on utter nonsense. The concept of monarchy, whether predominantly in Christian states, is that God anoints the monarch. The monarch owes his power to God, and therefore he or she rules the state, regardless of the democracy. I mean, by definition, that's nonsense. Not only that, the monarch, who may well have had some virtues, although they're very dubious ones, to get to be king or queen in the first place, is allowed to, in perpetuity, pass that control, that ridiculous, undemocratic, nonsensical, quasi-religious control onto their successors in eternity. The Scottish Parliament signed up to that, took the
Mm.
oath when it
But
was formed. There's only one word for monarchy, it's bollocks. The whole thing's bollocks from start to finish.
so, do you think?
They may have
I
rather
mean,
have a
there's a lot of
republic.
people suggesting that once the Queen finally dies, and she's getting on a bit, um, people are not really very fond of Charles. That even the appreciation of the monarchy, which certainly seems to exist in other parts of the UK, if not in Scotland, will be diminished. And I don't know what the Queen's making of being dumped as head of state. The palace doesn't seem to have made a comment. But do you think that's true? I mean, do you think we are seeing generally the sort of death throes, albeit a bit slow, of the idea of a monarchy in the UK?
Never underrate the survival capacity of a monarchy. I mean, the firm, as they call themselves, the Windsors, have played the game superbly well. I, for one, don't believe that Charles will ever be king, even if he's alive when the Queen dies. I think the plans are already been afoot way back to jump the succession line to William. And William has appeals to a lot of very dubious people across a great deal of dubious reasons. So I don't think we're ever going to see, and I never underrate the publicity machine of the palace to shift the narrative. I mean, the biggest threat to the monarchy in my lifetime was the death of Diana. I thought this really, the sheer sordidness of the whole background of it and the whole circumstances and the appalling, tragic nature of her death. The Queen had her annus horribilis, and they've bounced back very successfully.
You don't think if things go badly for Andrew in America with the case against him and Epstein, you don't think that might also be another nail in the coffin? I mean, obviously the British police have decided they're not going to pursue any further concerns about it, but he still faces the trial in America.
But if they took Andrew away in chains and put him in San Quentin in a solitary cell in striped pajamas, it wouldn't dent the kind of boneheads that cluster around Buckingham Palace waving Union Jacks. The monarchy is based on people's something in the human psyche's desperate need for somebody to worship. I mean, they've slid away, although you still have the Archbishop of Canterbury parading and all the religious aspects. They've slid away from that. They're now actually openly a highly sophisticated and really very cheap public relations scheme. And people love our monarchy. When they go about the globe, people dance about them. I'm sure if they went to Barbados tomorrow, or went to Barbados after they dumped the Queen, they would still turn out and wave flags and say, "God bless you, Her Majesty." And that's what we should do. We should turn them into some sort of comic sideshow. I'll probably get lynched by some rabid royalists for saying this. But
sticking with the idea of greater democracy then in place of a monarchy, it's encouraging to note that the three parties on track to form Germany's next coalition government have been locked in tense negotiations over the future of European powerhouse. But regarding one seemingly radical issue, they are united, and that is lowering the voting age to 16. The Social Democrats, the Greens and the pro-business Free Democrats have signed up to reduce the age at which Germans can vote from 18 in acknowledgement that an increasingly politicised generation of young people must have a future say in the way the country is run. If their plan goes ahead, Germany would join Austria, the Isle of Man and Guernsey as the only other places in Western Europe with such a low voting age. Scotland also allows 16-year-olds to vote, although the UK does not allow Scottish 16 to 17-year-olds to vote in Westminster elections. In a handful of German states, this has recently been allowed also, but only for local or regional votes. Such a move nationally could also pave the way for other countries to follow the continent's largest economy. Obviously, the decision to reduce the voting age in 2014 was regarded as pretty radical in Scotland. 75% of then registered 16 to 17-year-olds voted in the 2014 independence referendum. Since then, however, there has been a less engaged 16 to 17-year-old group in elections. And that's according to some surveys and studies that have been done, because these young people don't find local elections or even Scottish parliamentary elections have the same appeal as changing history, which was the point of the 2014 independence referendum. But clearly, it was the right thing to do. And surely, if you're able to pay tax, marry legally, have children legally, you should be allowed to vote. I mean, wasn't that what the American Wars of Independence were about? No taxation without representation. Shouldn't it really be just a standard across Europe?
Yeah. But these things are gauged by the people who have the power to influence them, very often not on any rational democratic consideration. They're gauged on the fact, how is that demographic likely to vote? And the opposition to it, which I have to say I'm not among, I'm wholly in favour of votes for 16-year-olds. I remember what it was like to be a 16-year-old. And so the most people, I would guess, what opposed to is the fact, element of reality in this. Is a 16-year-old, yes, we can give them a driving license. They can go out on the road with a lethal machine. We can tax them. But is that the same as giving them a franchise? I mean, the awarding of the franchise as a very gradual thing over centuries. The very concept of a franchise for the ordinary man, remember, was alien to most of our world history. These things only crept in, the French Revolution and on, where it began to be seen, Britain could be seen to have a franchise of sorts, with the royal boroughs, no votes for women, property required, all the rest of it. So it's all been a creeping mix of self-interest, gross self-interest, and no morality. But to some rational argument, do we really want 16-year-olds to be making that judgment? Now, I have some qualifications in it I think we have to look hard at. As a 16-year-old, I was influenced in politics wholly by newspapers, by broadcasters, by the BBC, and predominantly by the men who'd returned from the war, the Second World War, a highly politicised generation. And I went down the Glasgow barrows and listened to them in soapboxes. There was a famous character in Glasgow called Guy Aldred, who, out of his own finances, very much an upper class guy, went around in old-fashioned gaiters and maintained a little shop in George Street and published 5 radical newspapers and used to welcome young teenagers. And I used to go in with my friend, and he would show us horrific photographs of what war had done to people. And, what's the young person now influenced by at that age? Yes, they're more intelligent, they've got access to more hard information if they look in the right places and they've been educated to evaluate it. But they're also assaulted by social media.
But you can't denounce a generation, and you can't withhold the democratic right to have a say in their future because the society they live in has changed. That's not fair, Peter. And that sounds like self-interest from someone of your generation.
Don't put words in my mouth, Maggie. Listen a bit more carefully to what I'm saying. I'm simply saying I'm aware of these divisions, that not all of the opposition to it is. I am squarely behind 16-year-olds having the vote, always have been, with all the qualifications. I'm simply saying we've got to be able to deal with the argument. I mean, if there's one major flaw that the independence movement has and the socialist movement before it has, they're completely unable to articulate the arguments of the opposition. They can't bring themselves to consider that anybody would have a different opinion from themselves, even if they totally disagree with it. And they always want to argue that morality is on our side and immorality is on the other side. And I'm a creature of that myself to some degree. But in a real politic world, you have to deal with that. I mean, I've just sent for a book. I'll guarantee you, not a 1/10% of the independent supporters have even looked at this book or would hold up some form of independence crucifix and say, look who wrote it, we can't. It is a statement, should old acquaintance be forgot, a statement by an archetypal member of the British establishment. But in his examination of the arguments of the nationalists and the arguments of the unionists, one perfectly shows our arguments as they truly are. I'm going to use some of them as slogans, but then goes on to, as he sees it, demolish it. You must know your opponent. I won't call them your enemy, but cries of indignation and indignation is really something that's going to have to be. We're going to have to find a vaccine against it because it's going to be the
Well,
death of the
one of
industry.
the things about extending the franchise to 16-year-olds is, of course, it gives a real opportunity for proper civic education in schools, and that's something that a lot of people have been pushing for. So I'm going to move on very quickly to the last story of the night. We probably won't have much time to discuss it. I just want to put the figures out there. That's the news that Scotland's international exports increased by 3.4% in 2019. 2019, of course, we should remember, was before we left the EU. The growth in international exports was driven by an increase in the exports of services, up 9.5%, and this included strong growth in exports of information and communication services. Scotland's exports to EU countries increased by 2.6%, up 420 million to 16.4 billion in 2019, and exports to non-EU countries also increased, up 730 million to 18.7 billion in 2019. Scotland's exports to the rest of the UK also increased in 2019, up 2.5 billion to 52 billion. One of the things that's often said about Scottish exports is that our biggest export partner is the rest of the UK, and that's the reason why independence is a bad idea and why Brexit wouldn't affect us. What people forget, of course, that is in the food and drink industry at least, most of that export is in raw materials, which are then sent to England to be processed for onward sale to the EU as processed foods. Would be very interesting, Peter, I think, to see, and very quickly, if you don't mind, what those figures might look when we look at 2020 or even 2021, because in 2020, of course, we were still in the transition year. But it gives a benchmark, I think, to see where Scotland's export history was, where we will see a decline, especially when we see these rather toxic trade deals that we opened the program with happening. So very briefly, what's your comment on those figures?
Well, really, I don't disagree with anything you've said, Maggie. I mean, 2019 seems a lifetime ago now. Pre-COVID, it's like the adults of my childhood would say before the war, and 2019 seems to be before the war. 2019 showed what Scotland was capable of, and much more if it was independent. We've been faced by a great economic, social, health calamity, and it's changed the whole nature of the game. We have to hold our belief, as you say, to use that as a benchmark for going forward, not as pessimism. Look at the death blow we've been dealt by COVID. It shows us what we can do and what we will do again.
Well, there's been two themes tonight, I think, Peter: indignation and self-interest. Neither are a particularly pleasant thing to have to witness, but we're going to have a little bit of Broadcasting Scotland self-interest. And that's just to remind you that if you've enjoyed the programme tonight, if you think there is a place for independent broadcasting that brings you the kinds of figures and stories that you don't hear on the BBC or on other mainstream channels, then please consider supporting the station. Go on to the website www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and see if you can't make a regular donation to help keep us going. We have a lot of exciting and interesting ideas coming in the next 12 months to bring you, but it takes money. So if you've enjoyed tonight, you know what to do. Put your hand in your pocket. I hope you have a very good evening. I'll be back on Sunday with the Sunday show. Until then, good night.